This next installment of video lessons. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. And today we're looking at the New Deal. Okay, this was the American response to the Great Depression. And as we learned in the last video, the Great Depression was the worst economic crisis to ever hit this country. And so unprecedented government action was required. At least that was the belief of the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If you recall, he won in a landslide in the 1932 election against Herbert Hoover, and now we're going to discuss the various programs that he enacted in an effort to fight or combat the Great Depression, and this period is known as the New Deal. Okay, so I have a timeline here for you. I'm not going to go into all of these in detail right now. Many of these we'll talk about later on in the presentation. But in 1933, it was about stopping the bleeding. Okay, the Great Depression was huge and horrifying. People were starving on the streets. They were losing their homes, losing their businesses, losing their farms. Unemployment was through the roof. This was a massive economic catastrophe, and something had to be done. So in 1933, and to a certain extent 34, this was about stopping the bleeding, providing immediate relief, okay? So you see there are a variety of acts that were, and different actions and activities by government that were passed both in 1933 and 34. You don't have to memorize all of these, but one of the things I want to point out here is this idea of the fireside chats. Fireside chats were FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's weekly radio addresses to the nation, and people tuned in like this was must-see TV, like everybody had to listen to the president. These fireside chats connected FDR to the people in a way that was impossible beforehand. Radio was now the primary mode of communication. TV would change that later on, but right now we're in radio, and he was able to reach most of the country with these weekly fireside chats where he explained to the American people what was happening and what he was doing to fight against the Great Depression and get the country back on track. This exploded his popularity because people felt connected to their leader in ways that they had never felt connected before. And this allowed FDR to enjoy unprecedented popularity, which would prove important in getting all of these various acts and government activities through Congress. Without his soaring popularity, this stuff doesn't happen, okay? So it's very important. I wanted to point out the fireside chats. Okay, so here, 1935, we have additional acts that are passed. 1936, FDR is reelected. You have the peak of the New Deal in 36, okay? In 1937, FDR did something bad. He tried to pack the Supreme Court. We'll talk about that later, but that plan would fail. And we have a brief recession with a raise in unemployment in 37, and then in 1938, we are moving past the Great Depression. Some other acts are passed, and conservative Southern Democrats are opposing the New Deal. So FDR was attacked on both the right and the left. So that's important to note. Okay, so this is important. So we're talking about ideas here. So liberalism, the term liberalism changes in meaning. Now, I want to refresh our memories. Back in the founding period, you have classical liberalism, okay? That was the original meaning of liberalism, was this classical idea where the key ideas are personal responsibility, personal freedom, limited government. Limited, limited, limited. You want massively limited government, just big enough to do the bare minimum, nothing more, nothing less. Protect natural rights, and that's it. Then once we get into that was the 18th century. Once we get into the 19th century, you get something called progressive liberalism. And this is where I want you to think about the progressives that we learned about previously, right? The progressive era, and this belief that government should take control and should be more engaged and more involved in people's lives. Some prime examples of these progressives were Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, okay? Key ideas, we have regulation of big business, but we still have individual freedom and opportunity. We do have increased authority of government under the progressive liberalism. Now with FDR, we're transitioning into something called social welfare liberalism. This liberalism is going to dominate for the rest of the 20th century, okay? This is 20th century, this is FDR, okay? Key ideas were social welfare, massive increase in the scope of national programs and legislation. You have very big government. So you see you have to be careful when you use the term liberalism. You need to specify, because there are different types of liberalism. So now, what we're going to be talking about today is social welfare liberalism, and that was championed by FDR, 20th century. Okay, so the big thing were the 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. That was the 3 R's that FDR was attacking in order, or FDR was, employing to attack the Great Depression and kill it where it lives, right? So relief, immediate economic help to deal with the Great Depression. Then we have recovery, restoring the economy back to what it was, trying to create new jobs, spending federal money to revive the economy. Then reform, implementing new regulations and permanent programs to try to prevent another economic depression in the future. Okay, so I want you to remember relief, recovery, reform. Okay, these are the 3 things. Now, just to give you some examples of what that looks like: relief, Emergency Banking Act, Civil Conservation Corps, right? Recovery, Agricultural Readjustment Act, National Industrial Recovery Act. Reform, Securities and Exchange Act, which created the Securities and Exchange Commission, which governs the stock market, okay? And the Social Security Administration, right? So these are just examples of what this relief, recovery, reform look like. So I want to go back to the slide. I want you to pause the video if you got to and write all this down. Relief, recovery, reform. This is very important, okay? And these are examples of what relief looked like, what recovery looked like, what reform looked like. We'll talk about these later on in the presentation. We'll talk about the specifics of each. Okay, so FDR was charming, politically savvy. He was all about experimenting, okay? And this included government programs, government policy. Like I said earlier, he established a very effective rapport with the American people via his fireside chats. Now, FDR envisioned a large role for the executive branch, the federal government generally, but the executive branch specifically, right? He packed his administration with intellectuals and administrators, all right? He also, something important to note, he appointed Black people and also women to positions of power within his administration. This is really, really important because this is one of the first times that happens. This was pushed by his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. I'll talk a little bit more about her later. Okay, so the first 100 days is known as the most significant part of a presidency. Okay, it's where you have the opportunity to get the most done, the most legislation through Congress, and this 100 days started with FDR because he promised in his first 100 days of the administration he was going to do several things. So he passed in those first 100 days 15 bills aimed at 4 problems. Okay, banking failures, agricultural overproduction, the business slump, and unemployment. So he passed 15 bills aimed at attacking those 4 problems. And I'm going to talk about some of those, what he passed in detail in a little bit. Now, there were attacks against the New Deal. Not everybody was on board. People believed it was a potential threat to individual responsibility, a threat to personal freedom, that it was paternalistic, that it was the federal government stepping in and acting like people's parents, and people like the people are children and the government's the parent, and that this was an imbalance of power, that this shouldn't exist. People argued that the federal government would have too much power if we allowed this to happen. But the biggest attacks came from the left. They said it didn't go far enough. So the conservatives are over here with the threat to individual responsibility, personal freedom, all that. But the left was like, you're not going far enough. This is not even close to far enough. So they were upset that it wasn't as expansive as it should be. Okay, so Emergency Banking Act. Now this is, you guys can read this on your own. I don't need to read out each of these, but you should pause the video. These were some of the key bills and executive orders that were passed. That were put into play to attack the Great Depression. So pause the video, jot this down. Okay, the Emergency Banking Act, Glass-Steagall, Homeowners Loan Corporation, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and Agricultural Adjustment Act. Okay, so these are all very, very important that I want you to pause the video and write this down because these are all very key. We're going to be exploring some of these in more detail in class, but at least I want you to have the basic definition of each. And again, here's some more. So National Industrial Recovery Act. You have the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. You have the Public Works Administration and the Civil Works Administration. So this was, these were all important acts that were passed during the first 100 days. And so we want to pay attention to that. Okay, so then we have a break. Then we move into a second New Deal. And FDR was trying to focus, this is on the recovery part and the reform part. We're shifting from recovery to reform, right? That's where we get the Revenue Act of 1935. National Labor Relations Act is going to be really, really important for unions and collective bargaining. Social Security Act of 1935 is going to establish a Social Security program that's very important. So 1936 election, he wins in a landslide. When Huey Long was assassinated, that basically removed any real challenge. Republicans, like I said there, have no answer to FDR's popularity, so he won like crazy. But then we have this stalemate. So the recession stops momentum for the reforms and legislation. Court packing scandal also did hit his popularity. See, FDR was upset because the court was overturning some of his initiatives, right? They said, no, it's not constitutional, you can't do that. So what FDR tried to do is to get more Supreme Court justices put on the bench that were loyal to him, that would outnumber the ones who disagreed with him. This was ultimately unsuccessful, which was good because it's massively unconstitutional. Yeah, so that action of trying to pack the Supreme Court lessened his popularity significantly. So, societal impact of the New Deal. Huge impact when we're talking about organized labor. You have a massive increase in the number of unions and the power of labor unions. The Congress Industrial Organization was a new union movement that was promoting industrial unionism. And what that is a uniting of all workers in an industry into one union. So all the steel workers in one union, not just, here's a steel worker union here, here's a steel worker union there. There's different ones in different states. Some of them don't have any at all. The idea that across an entire industry, you have one union fighting for all the workers. This was a new idea at the time. It's pretty standard now, but it was a new idea at the time. You have a massive increase in union involvement in politics, and unions at this point become aligned with the Democratic Party. Women and African Americans, you have enhanced welfare of women. You do get female appointees to the Roosevelt administration. Frances Perkins is probably the most famous of those. She was a cabinet secretary and the first woman cabinet secretary, which is really, really important. Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of Franklin Roosevelt, was instrumental in these changes, in both fighting for the rights of women and fighting for the rights of minorities. She encouraged and in many cases pushed for these things. Okay, so both women, and they didn't benefit as much as white men, but they did benefit from these programs. So African Americans benefited. They were employed by the WPA, and there were also appointments to federal office. In the South, we still have massive discrimination, so the lowest possible paying jobs were available to African Americans. You had massive social and political discrimination. North and Midwest, it was a little bit better, but not by much. There's still massive amounts of discrimination, and in the North and Midwest, you have massive migration of African Americans to cities to look for jobs and more opportunities. So migrant workers also had some benefits. They were able to qualify for aid and join the CIO. This is a major step in becoming Americanized and accessing the benefits of other New Deal programs. Cesar Chavez is a really important guy. His experience during this period molded him into a key reformer of the 1960s. So when we get to the 1960s, we're going to talk more about Cesar Chavez. So I want you to keep that name in the back of your mind because we're going to come back to him in the 1960s. The Chinese and Asians generally not much benefit from the New Deal. The environment got a lot of benefits. So you have the Tennessee Valley Authority, you have Soil Conservation Service, the Rural Electrification Administration, right? So you have all of these programs that were designed to enhance the environment and also get access. Like the Rural Electrification Administration was getting electricity to rural areas that previously didn't have it. So at this point in history, you still have Americans without electricity. The Tennessee Valley Authority and the Rural Electrification Administration were instrumental in changing that and giving Americans access to these things. So New Deal legacy. The arts, this was huge because the New Deal programs employed a lot of artists. And you had the Federal Art Project, the Federal Writers Project, the Federal Theater Project. So this is a great time to be an artist, to be engaged in popular culture. They got a lot of support from the government. So you have a big increase in the impact and importance of the arts in this country. Big picture legacy. So some thought it went too far. The conservatives said this is way too far, but on the left, they said it's not enough. It redefined and extended 19th century liberalism and changed it into social welfare liberalism. Democratic Party now controls the political sphere and will for quite some time. You have a revolution in the bureaucracy and a massive expansion of executive power. Unprecedented in American history. Massive expansion of executive power. So I want you to remember that. Massive revolution in the bureaucracy, massive expansion of executive power. And that, folks, is the end of this video. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video.